In this video, you'll be learning about setting up email addresses for website owners at their own private domain names. You'll learn about different hosting and server setups and how different server environments need certain email procedures. Sometimes email should be managed at a different server than the website itself, and you'll learn when and how to do it. You'll know what's needed for setting up new email addresses, changing the DNS so that the domain points emails to the right place, and about incorporating existing email addresses into the website using forwarding. Let's get started. Let's look at a site I own at gregdavis.com within its cPanel that I have at the SiteGround hosting account. Inside the cPanel, I've gone to the home page now of the control panel, and one of the first sections is called Mail, and let's just look at email accounts and how they're controlled inside of the cPanel. Now, if I were using SiteGround for my email accounts, I could just add another email address right here, choose a password, and choose a mailbox quota, and click Create Account. If my DNS records for this domain name, gregdavis.com, were pointing at SiteGround for email, then that email would work, and I could then set up an email client or log in to webmail via any browser, and I could use an email address at my private domain name, gregdavis.com. Now, I don't use SiteGround for managing my email addresses at gregdavis.com. And I mentioned it in the last video, but I use the Rackspace Apps email provider to control email addresses where I want a little bit more storage space and a very professional management of my email addresses. If I look under mailboxes at the Rackspace Apps control panel, you can see that I've got several domain names where I control email addresses using the Rackspace servers. And one of the reasons that I use Rackspace for email is that you get 25 gigabytes for storage of emails and attachments with your email addresses. Now, if we go back to the control panel, you can see that by default, the control panel urges us to use a 250 megabyte mailbox quota. Now, it's a good idea to do this. If you choose unlimited for an email address, it's possible, depending on how the client uses email, you might fill up your allocated storage inside of your website server. This is one of the reasons why it's a recommended method to keep email stored at a different server than the website itself. Behind the scenes of this setup, I can show you how the DNS records for the domain name gregdavis.com differ from if I was holding my email at the web server. I need to point certain DNS records to Rackspace in order to have emails that come to any address at gregdavis.com go to the Rackspace email servers. And those entries inside of DNS records are called MX entries. They're mail exchange entries for the DNS. Now, if I look at gregdavis.com, you can see that I'm using a remote mail exchanger set so that when the domain points email or web traffic to gregdavis.com, one of the things that it does is it uses name servers. If you look at my SiteGround account, you can see that my DNS name servers are a private location inside of the SiteGround's servers. Now, I'm the only one that uses these name servers because I have all my client sites, as I've shown you here, at this single IP address and at this location inside of the SiteGround servers. However, when my domain registrar GoDaddy points all web traffic towards SiteGround, I need to change the MX records inside of my cPanel for gregdavis.com. So I've got a remote mail exchanger selected here, and I added 2 MX records recommended by Rackspace over here. Now, the recommended MX records to point mail at the Rackspace servers, as you can see, are mx1.emailserver.com and mx2.emailserver.com. You can get those MX records and how they're supposed to be set up from any email provider or email server provider that you're using if it's separate from your web server. Now, since these MX records point to the Rackspace email server, I can see that at Rackspace, I have a $2 a month charge for every email box that I use that gives me 25 gigabytes. I do set up client sites at Rackspace for those that need a whole lot of email storage and who don't have a setup where they want to delete email from the server as it comes in. Most of your clients will most likely not need an upgraded service like this, but they can use email at the actual server where you host the website as long as they have a setting where they limit the number of emails and the amount of storage that email address is allowed to keep. By coaching your clients to set up their email clients like Outlook or Thunderbird from Mozilla, you coach them to delete the emails off of the server when they come in. Potentially, you can have them keep several thousand emails on the server if they'd like to go back and search through old emails for a period of months or years. But it's a best practice to delete old emails off the server so it doesn't just continually build up and waste space on your web server. Now, at the managed WordPress hosting company Flywheel, that I highly recommend and use for my high-end clients and my own websites, you'll note that they do not host email at Flywheel. It's a real positive piece of advice that they do not host email because they believe in working with best-of-breed providers for everything they do. That just means that they're really good at hosting websites and HTTP traffic, but they don't specialize in being an email provider. And so they recommend that you point your DNS at an external email provider like I've been talking about in this video. And they do recommend Google Apps, which has a charge for it. Zoho Mail, which actually has free email for up to 25 users per domain name. And then Rackspace Email, which I do use, costs $2 per email address per month. Now, I do use Zoho Mail for several of my clients because it's free to set up, and you can point your DNS to Zoho and host your website at a server that hosts websites and host email at a different server at Zoho Mail. You'll find if you research it that the highest end and the more expensive managed WordPress hosts recommend hosting your email externally from the website instead of having it hosted at the same place. When you're just starting out, and if you use best practices for setting up email, if you have, say, a shared account at SiteGround or a shared account somewhere else that they use a cPanel and provide email hosting, well, you are able to set up using best practices so that your server doesn't get filled up and shut down. One of the reasons I kept my mail at Rackspace, even though I don't host my websites there anymore, is that I had email addresses and aliases set up at gregdavis.com for several years before I moved my website hosting away from Rackspace and to Flywheel and also to SiteGround. One of the things that email aliases can do for you is that you can create email addresses to use for signing up for services or anything you like. I think, what do I have here? I have 321 different email addresses that are aliases of my Greg Davis email address. Now, each one of these email addresses, for example, camtasia@gregdavis.com. If someone sends an email to that email alias, I will get it at my regular Greg Davis email account. However, I can't send from that address. And what this gives me is that if I get spammed or if any of these email addresses get added to a spammers list or get sold, I can just turn off that email address and I no longer have that email address and I will not be getting any spam. So whenever I sign up for a mailing list or a newsletter online for information that I want to hear, I create or use one of these email addresses so that if at any time my email address gets sold or placed on a spammers list, I can just turn that off, and I never share my real base email address with anyone in the online communities. One of the great things about Rackspace apps and Rackspace email services is that you can have unlimited number of aliases pointing to an email address at your Rackspace account. Finally, back in the SiteGround gregdavis.com cPanel, I'll go back home and finish by showing you what email forwarding is about. If I do have an email address at a private domain like gregdavis.com, I can set up an email forwarder which will forward email automatically when sent to an address I create at gregdavis.com to any email address that I or my client owns. For example, if I have a special email address, say greg@gregdavis.com, but I don't want to set up that email to be checked with Outlook or use the webmail interface, I can have that email forwarded to my Gmail account, for example, or my Yahoo account that I know I check all the time. I'll often use email forwarding to make it easy on my clients so they can have an email address they can advertise on their website or advertise on their business cards that is a private email address at their domain name, but then they want that email to be forwarded and come up inside of their Gmail account, for example. In this lesson, we went over private domain name email addresses and some of the different ways to set them up. Later in this chapter, we'll be setting up email addresses at a live server and experimenting to learn about email hosting for clients, DNS and MX records at the domain name, and email forwarding. In the next video, we'll go back to setting up systems within WordPress websites to take control of transactional email sent by WordPress itself. See you there.